Hello, my name is Ian, and today we're talking about Arnold van Gennep's The Rites of Passage. This is an excerpt. The full Rites of Passage book came out in 1909 as Les Rites de Passage and really entered into the vocabulary of not simply folklore research, but it's one of those terms that has entered into the common parlance. You have probably heard of a rite of passage. It is a standard expression now, but it has its origins in Van Gennep's work. This is an excerpt, as I said. It's taken from, it was edited down by Alan Dundes for his collection International Folkloristics, and I highly recommend the book itself. The book basically provides an awful large amount of examples that fill and illustrate Van Gennep's basic idea about the rite of passage. Prior to this work, folklorists and anthropologists and so on had been interested in studying rites, but they typically tended to think of them individually. So they would study funeral rites, they would study wedding rites, and they might even study them cross-culturally and compare the wedding rites or the funeral rites of one society to another. But they never sort of took that one step back and suggested or contemplated whether the rite itself was a thing, whether there was like an invariant structure. And so Van Gennep really is kind of hinting towards what would later be called structuralism, deep patterns that are clearly present in within human constructions of meaning. And so what is this structure? Well, first of all, what's his basic idea? The basic idea is that the individual exists within groups. I mean, that's sort of a given. And within those groups, they are accorded a particular status depending on where they are in their life. And that status has certain rights, responsibilities, freedoms, expectations. And then they grow up or something happens and they go and enter into a different status with different rights and responsibilities and freedoms and expectations. And as they move from one stage to the other, the group has these ways of indicating that change, because change is fundamentally a kind of a frightening thing. And through some ceremonial practices, or through at least some kind of performance, that passage from one stage to another is marked. It might be something that could be considered otherwise frightening, and yet there is now an aesthetically pleasing ceremonial pattern that marks that transition. It takes the individual away from what they had been living and towards another way of how they will be living. And so the structure, what he describes is separation, transition, incorporation. Separation from the prior status, the small subgroup within the group, as it were, that in which the individual was once inhabiting. This transition, this period when they are neither in this original status nor have they yet to attain this new status, and then incorporation as they move into this new status. Now, there are rites that tend to emphasize one over the other. Initiation ceremonies, birthing ceremonies, they are much more about incorporation. Funerals, they are much more about separation. And retirement parties, they are much more about separation. They are much more about the departure than they are about the bringing in. And then there are things like first menstruation rituals, adulthood rituals, and so on, weddings, which are much more about the transition, because the person is really very much present for all three stages, and it's the transition that is accorded sort of the primary focus. Arguably, all three movements are present in every rite, but sometimes one of the movements is the more emphatic one within a particular rite. So another term that he uses is this notion of the threshold. this movement through place. And threshold, the word he gets, the words he uses is liminal. Liminus would be the noun, and liminal would be the adjective. The threshold, the entrance to the thing in which you place a door, but really the spot between two rooms, the Janus figure, as it were. And so he will often use the words preliminary, things that are happening before one goes through the threshold, liminal or liminary, the things that are happening at the threshold, and postliminal or postliminary in terms of moving away, having moved through and now passed into the threshold, beyond the threshold. So we might also know the word liminal from subliminal in terms of something coming in not through the main entrance but underneath, as in subliminal advertising. And it's this transitional period that tends to be very exciting, because it's really the transition that is the most daunting. That is the pivot. That is when one is going from one stage to another, and that is when you are not necessarily determined by those sets of expectations that are incumbent upon you. Here's a good example. It has to do with like Frosh Week at a university, or New Student Week, or whatever the beginning of the autumn semester is called at your institution. And that is a period where new people are entering into the group. They are becoming students, but, at least this is the conceit, they're not students yet. There has to be some kind of movement where they have clearly moved literally and figuratively and in some ways like emotionally from their prior groups. So from their old high school, from their old hometown, from their old whatever, and they're coming to this place, and they undergo some period where it is festive. There is different kinds of food and food consumption. There is not necessarily in a Frosh Week in the 21st century that has issues of liability and issues of administrative oversight, but there might be licentiousness of some description. It might be much more sensory. I'm trying to sort of dodge around a couple of potentially dangerous terms. And even things like, you are given a shirt, or the expectation that you might be wearing your Frosh shirt every single day. And in a way, what they are doing is, you can make an argument that they're kind of sort of dismantling your old identity and rebuilding a new one. Rebuilding one that is transitioning you towards this new thing as a student. And then the thing about rites of passage, the thing about customs in general, the thing about festivals, the thing about all these things is that they come to an end. Because they are moments, they are pivots between one period of relative stasis and another period of relative stasis. And then a little blip. So we can think about the various stages that a person might go through. They go from being unborn to born. And there is a marker that takes place at which point they are recognized as entering the group. And that doesn't necessarily take place at the moment of childbirth. It is often just soon thereafter when an actual ceremony can take place. He makes this point of talking about, Van Gennep makes this point about talking about social puberty, for example, where basically the group has decided that at this particular age, independent of actual physical development, whether your body has changed and you are no longer a child and you are now an adult, whether you have experienced menarche or whether you have, started to develop, mustache or whatever marker you might have in terms of an indicator of adulthood. I'll say, no, 13. That's it. You go from this stage to this stage. And especially when we start talking about perhaps celebrating these things in kind of cohorts, a group travels moves through at this particular stage. So there's the ceremonies around the transition. Sometimes they happen at the exact same moment, like marriage. where you enter into a sort of legal contract, and sometimes it's the connotation. Funeral is another example. I'm jumping back and forth, but I'll get back to sort of the life cycle. Funeral is another example. A person dies, and soon thereafter, but not at the exact moment of death, there is a ceremony at which point that person is transitioned from being amongst the living to being amongst the dead. And again, there's sort of magical practices associated with it. And so you also have, prior to it, you have the period of the wake, where, or some kind of mourning or some kind of sitting where the person is both alive and dead. And that's really the transitional one. The funeral is the rite of ultimately of separation, but incorporation into the afterlife, if you were. But this transitional stage, the body is dead, the spirit is still here, and you have so many wonderful descriptions of this person who is the spirit in this liminal state. They are still with us. Their soul has yet to depart, but they will be going, and so they go. And then, of course, we act differently. We enter into this. It's not sensory. It's not necessarily joyous, although there's opportunities for certain kinds of inversions of the normal order. But then it ends, and the person is gone, and the group moves on. Again, because these things end, they go from a constant to another constant. So you have birth, you have puberty, you have marriage, you have parenthood, you have menopause, you have death. Those might be sort of the sort of almost the purely biological. I know marriage is not a purely biological one; it's a social construct. But that movement of being, fertile in potency, or sexual impotency, to sanctioned to be sexual in terms of the marriage and the beginning of family and so on. So it's that cusp between biological development and sort of the social development that is immediately imposed on it in many societies. And then we have these other transitions, because they're not simply rooted in biology. They're not simply rooted in the human as a biological thing. I'm really good with the words, aren't I? So it's not simply about biological development. It is also about the various levels of status that the social group might have. So we can think. I've already mentioned graduation. I've already mentioned or initiation. And we're going to talk about graduation as well. We can talk about all these things where you are literally given some new kind of position. And then we have ceremonies, we have markers, we have ways of easing that transition from one stage to another. We have all these things that are present. And when a new one emerges, when we decide that there is some kind there's something new that needs to be marked, even if it doesn't have a precedent for it being marked before, we kind of know how to do it because we have this structure. So that's one of the things about the reading, is that as you read the structure of the Rites of Passage, or read about the structure of the Rites of Passage, it gives voice to something that you probably already realize, but you might not have had voice to it. And once you do, then you really, really see the pattern around you. This is something that you know innately, but the fact that he has this structure is quite fantastic. So we move through these various stages, and we move through these various statuses, and we're going to move from one to another. So if we think of like contemporary rites that are starting to emerge, they're emerging in the past 15 or 20 years, where the things like when people coming out or people transitioning, we have this this idea of very dangerous, and particularly in heteronormative, patriarchal, sexist societies, those are dangerous acts, announcing a change in status in that way. And we have ceremonies that are emerging that recognize that. We have, even if they're not necessarily ceremonies in terms of a place where one gathers, we have social scripts that mark these things. And so, I imagine that ceremonies will emerge, or probably have emerged, but we will know more about them as they become more and more commonplace and more part of our vernacular. But this is the structure that we have. So, one of the terms, this transitional stage, again, is something that we really want to pay a little bit more of attention to, because that is often the basis of so much. It's going to reemerge when we talk about calendar customs. It's going to reemerge when we talk about almost any kind of ceremony, and it has to do with that betwixt and between. It has to do with that moment that is most different from the ordinary and the everyday. And we have these periods of inversion, as it were, of we normally behave in a particular staid pattern, and at this period of transition, whether on the part of the individual or whether on the part of the collective, when the collective is gathering and recognizing and controlling change through ceremonial actions. It's at those times when a new set of rules applies. It's those times, as I was saying earlier, when people are engaged in different kind of food habits, different kind of clothing habits, different kind of ways of being embodied. We get this term, the carnivalesque. Carnival, I'm describing a calendar custom right now because this is the language that we use. But Carnival is the pre-Lenten festival. Carne, meat, flesh. Vale, goodbye. This is the farewell to flesh. It's a festival of the flesh. You're in Christian tradition, you're going to go into 40 days of Lent. You're going to go into a period of fasting. So just before, you eat up all the stores. And it's this great festival of embodiment. If you're about to be spending 40 days thinking about matters of the spirit, why not spend a couple of days thinking about matters of the flesh? So you eat, so you drink, so you wear suggestive clothing, so you are not necessarily engaged in sex, but you are engaged in being a sexual being in terms of dance, in terms of movement. It's a crowd event. It's an embodied fleshy fest. It's a festival of the flesh. And it is the thing that's most marked about it is that it is different from how one typically operates in the day-to-day. And that's the concept of the carnivalesque. We get that from Mikhail Bakhtin in his description of the works of Rabelais and Carnival as it occurred in Gargantua, and as he describes in Gargantua. So basically the medieval forms of Carnival. This great subversive celebration that actually sort of, one of the things that it does is it, on a very functionalist basis, it lets off steam. It's one of the reasons that people are involved in many ways in other people's rites of passage, in that it is an opportunity to celebrate. It is an opportunity to momentarily take pause and focused on someone else, be in celebration. It's not my celebration, it's their celebration, but we are celebrating together, because that is the key to the rite of passage. It is focused on the individual, but it is about the group. It is about the individual moving through the group recognizing that this individual is moving through the group, and on the one step back, the group recognizing that it is fragile. It is fragile because it is dependent on the presence of individuals who shift in status as they go. And yet, through ceremonial purposes, one of the things that happens is that the group as an idea remains constant despite the fact that its constituent members pass through it. And so it is about this person is moving. Doubly so, perhaps it's most exemplary when we see it in the funeral practice, when it's like, this is someone who is leaving, but they are leaving us. And eventually all of us will be leaving this group, and yet the group remains because the membership keeps on being replenished. It's a sad thing when we talk about death, but think about graduation. Think about the group that is not defined by the family or the town or whatever, but by the university, by that context, where we have this idea of alumni. We have this idea of a student body that has persistence in time, despite the fact that every 4 years, when people graduate according to sort of regular schedules, the entire body is replenished, and that someone who is who enters into this into this calendar year 5 years hence will be gone, and there'll be no one who is present at this particular moment still present 5 years hence. It's a completely different group of people, and yet the group has constancy because there are ceremonies of entering, there's ceremonies of progressing, and there are ceremonies of leaving, and the group celebrates it in that way. I'm not saying that these things can't be lame. I'm saying that this is one of the things that happens, and one of the reasons that they happen is that it promotes the idea of the relationship between the group and the individual and the group. He has this wonderful section, and as I was preparing the video and rereading it again, because I actually reread it each and every time I go through and do this, I was struck, and maybe I'm just becoming an old person, more sentimental in my old age, but I was really struck by it. It's on page 104, and I'm going to read it in whole. We have seen that an individual is placed in various sections of society synchronically and in succession. In order to pass from one category to another, and to join individuals in other sections, he must submit, from the day of his birth to that of his death, to ceremonies whose forms often vary but whose function is similar. Sometimes the individual stands alone and apart from all groups. Sometimes, as a member of one particular group, he is separated from the members of others. Two primary divisions are characteristic of all societies, irrespective of time and place: the sexual separation between men and women, and the magico-religious separation between the profane and the sacred. However, some special groups, such as religious associations, totem clans, fraternities, castes, and professional classes, appear in only a few societies. Within each society there is also the age group, the family, and the restricted politico-administrative and territorial unit, a band, village, or town. In addition to this complex world of the living, there is the world preceding life and the one which follows death. These are the constants of social life, to which have been added particular and temporary events such as pregnancy, illnesses, dangers, journeys, etc. And always the same purpose has resulted in the same form of activity. For groups, as well as for individuals, life itself means to separate and to be reunited, to change form and condition, to die and to be reborn. It is to act and to cease, to wait and rest, and then to begin acting again, but in a different way. And there are always new thresholds to cross, the thresholds of summer and winter, of a season or a year, of a month or a night, the thresholds of birth, adolescence, maturity, and old age, the threshold of death, and that of the afterlife for those who believe in it. I think there's just something that is obviously describing what he is talking about in terms of the structure, sort of an anthropological, folkloristic view, but at the same time, it also describes something that is fundamental to the human condition, and we can just walk away at this point and be kind of moved by it. The idea of life as a form of flux that is often in these stages of constancy. This is who I am, this is where I am in life, and those categories might exist for years. And then there are interruptions, and all of a sudden we have something new, and that is what life is. And so again, I now start to sound like an old romantic when I'm waxing philosophically about sort of the beautiful sentiments that he's referring to. But it's that we exist in groups, and the group is constant, but it's fluid. And what's fluid is that the membership of the group wouldn't exist were it not for the individual members within it, and yet it has permanence despite the fact that groups move within it, because it demands permanence, because it creates permanence through ceremony, through recognizing change, recognizing the pivots of its members, and reaffirming that despite the individuals moving through it, there is something to return to. Boom. It's a wonderful article. I mean, it's a classic reading. it is a necessary reading. Every folklorist, you could make an argument that everyone in the humanities and social sciences should be familiar with this. It is the basis of so much theory, of so much custom. It's the basis of, of so much. But I digress, or rather, I go on too long. So I've been talking about Arnold van Gennep's The Rites of Passage. My name is Ian. I wish you nothing but the best as ever, my friends. So, take care, be well, and bye-bye.